shy of an hour, so I really wanted to highlight a few different things to demonstrate and hopefully excite anybody who's interested in LIDAR to have a general sense for the basics and how it's done, as well as some comparisons with ocean color. So I think we would exit. It's just a. Does anybody use LIDAR currently in their work? Right, okay. Two in the room growing. Okay. And so is that still recording? Yeah. Do I need to restart the recording?
No, not restart.
Oh, okay, great, okay. Great, so yeah, as I was saying, I also wanted to talk about some of the discoveries that we've already made with LIDAR, especially from satellite LIDAR. And then, of course, then show some of the issues with uncertainty and wrap up. So yeah, so first, some basics. LIDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, it's an acronym, but you'll probably see it mostly written in text as all lowercase, as I've often seen, but technically it is an acronym. It's an active measurement, so that means it has its own light source. As we've talked about, it emits photons, at least from satellite LIDAR, anywhere between 100 per second or 10,000 per second. A very small portion of those photons will return back to the sensor. For example, with ISAT-2 satellite, it emits 10,000 photons per second at the ocean surface, 12 on average return back. So it's a very, very small fraction of the signal that we're getting. And of the photons that return back, the principle is very simple. The idea is time of flight. So if we know the speed of light, which we do, and we know that there's an outbound and inbound flight, I guess you can think about it for a single photon. Basically, photons that come back to the sensor at a later time are further apart. And so this works basically as an altimeter. And there are fancier LIDARs that have multiple wavelengths and sometimes fluorescence or polarization channels. In the simplest possible case, this is what we're looking at. And from that vertical profile of photon height, you can then calculate other geophysical measurements, including attenuation or particular backscattering. Thereafter, you can calculate phytoplankton carbon, as we talked about, using empirical relationships and proxies. And importantly, there have not been any dedicated ocean optimized LIDARs in satellite yet, which means the satellite LIDAR studies from oceans that you've seen are using satellites that were initially intended for a different purpose, and then have been a lot of community work has been done to make those data usable for ocean studies. So there have been also, of course, LIDAR work that's been done off of planes and ships, and this is going back many, many decades. I'm not as intimate with that work because I don't often work with LIDARs from ships or planes, so I'm not going to talk about that today. But in the future, if we have more time, I think it would be great because you can have a lot of more resolution, more watercolumn resolution, and greater depth penetration from plane or ship LIDARs. And there's been some really cool pioneering work that's been done by Turnside and in particular Brian Collister, who's he's a new scientist as well, and you'll probably see him at conferences or see his work, and I would encourage you to talk to him about it as well. The two satellites that I'll focus on today are Calypso satellite and ISAT-2 satellite. Both satellites were developed and intended to observe either atmospheric cloud interactions in the case of Calypso, or ice sheets on land and in the ocean, as in the case of ISAT-2. The abbreviations are there. Those are the satellite names. The specific instruments are Calliope, which is aboard Calypso, and Atlas, which is aboard ISAT-2. I want to cover some very broad basics of the differences that can help you better understand advantages and disadvantages of using LIDAR for your work or having some context when reading papers that have used LIDAR. This is an image of Earth from one day with coverage from the Modus Aqua satellite, which is in colors, and you don't need to worry about the measurement. This is the VVP measurement. You can see the black lines of LIDAR data are the coverage from, in this case, Calypso. And so it's very, very different spatial coverage in one day. And there are patchiness, as you can see, but these two satellites fly in the same constellation in the A train. And so a lot of times you will have really beautiful matches where they're observing the same place of the ocean at the same time.
I don't see the.
Okay. And then in this slide, this one.
Thank you.
There are some differences when comparing the two satellites, especially with field measurements. And with MODIS Aqua or passive SWAT style satellites, the typical way to compare with an in situ measurement is to take a pixel that's centered around a 5x5 box, and you have then information from the ocean color satellites you can see on the left here. And with LIDAR, you don't have that because, again, you're observing lines of data in the long track direction. And so in my experience, I don't know if I've ever seen a point in situ to line up perfectly on a footprint from a LiDAR view. So you typically have some distance and separation between what is a point source and what are these lines of data, which can make direct comparisons with in situ data more challenging or really just more creative. And so other types of ways to compare with these data are needed as opposed to the traditional 5x5 box technique. Also to again, give a picture of the coverage. This is a graph from one of Mike's papers where you can see how the spatial coverage and resolution compares from a single day all the way up to a multiple day. And in the very bottom, you have this graph that's showing the number of months from the Calliope data product that have paired day and night retrievals. And again, because it's an active measurement, you can observe data in the nighttime. So for comparison, if you had to make this graph with MODIS Aqua, you would expect to see nothing, no color on the graph because there are no night retrievals from MODIS. Jeremy will certainly get into this in more detail next week when he visits, but as a refresher, with ocean color, again, it's an inverse problem. And so if you're interested in absorption or scattering, you have to make some assumptions about how those constituents vary with remote sensing reflectance by relating them through an inversion. And that's shown here. I don't know if anybody has seen or worked with this before. This is a simple general case of an inversion type problem. Again, ocean color data doesn't provide information during the night, and the retrievals are highly affected by clouds, aerosols, and low sun angle, which, especially in the poles, you can imagine means you have very, very few months of data between the clouds, even when it is daylight, or polar darkness, which is, nearly half the year. So as a comparison, we know from field work and from our own studies that the ocean's really complex. There's a lot of processes happening, as Patrick mentioned, from micron scale to tens and thousands of kilometers of all of Earth, compared to time variation as well. And when you think about a pixel from an ocean color satellite, you have data at the surface. The black here is to represent the black box in the sense that we don't have the depth resolution, and we know the signal is exponentially weighted toward the surface. And if you were to have a pixel with LiDAR, this is still from the surface. You have this one value, and in this case, it would be in the green. But from LiDAR, you can get depth resolved information. And so it provides us a picture, at least of some fraction of the water column. As I said, this is another comparison. In polar ecosystems during the winter time, you cannot get measurements from passive ocean color, but from LiDAR you can. And so imagine if you were working in polar ecosystems and you only had MODIS Aqua at your disposal, what you could do versus if you were working with Calliope or Calypso. So this inspires me when I think about just what kind of scale of questions you can ask and what kind of explorations you can make with these data. So again, as I mentioned, I don't want to talk about everything today, but I want to show at least some examples of things that have been done that inspire me in the work that I'm working on, as well as give a sort of sense for how the community's been evolving. So far, we have been able to produce global maps of phytoplankton carbon, again, derived from assumptions of how it covariates with precipitate backscattering by generating an ocean backscattering product. So this is work by Mike Barenfeld and Young Hewitt lately. I know Magnus's been working on a lot of this as well. And this came out in 2013. For reference, Calypso was launched in 2006. And so there've been a few pilot studies, but the first kind of global maps of phytoplankton carbon from space that you can do again daytime and nighttime were around 2013. So it's a very, very young and growing group. This is a very, very cool study that looked at quantifying diel vertical migration of zooplankton by comparing daytime and nighttime particulate backscattering. And this is the first paper that sort of discovered and observed that signal from space. And as we know from a lot of the work that in the presentations that have been done here, as well as maybe what you might know about backscattering and phytoplankton throughout the day, that there are also diel signatures in the phytoplankton themselves as they're growing and dividing. And so it's another area of work I think that could be explored with LIDAR, but hasn't totally yet. And I don't know where Nick is, maybe he's not in the room. His postdoc, I think, is based on working on that too, so he would be a good person to talk to. But in the simplest case, if you think about what signature of backscattering you might have at nighttime and daytime, it was basically a linear subtraction and comparing with in situ data to then be able to say on global scales, here's where we think these migrations are occurring versus not. And this is an area that's really ripe for more work. Yeah.
Are the black boxes of this bounders region?
I don't think so because they have, there would be more than that, I think. Emmanuel, do you remember from this paper? I think you're an author, which the black boxes are. It might be, could be temperature lines.
Yeah, it's
Yeah. I know the top and bottom ones at least are the permanently stratified versus not, which is set by an annual average cutoff of 15 degrees centigrade. That's this one. This section and this section. I think these are also some, yeah, I don't know how exactly. Yeah, Longhurst like, yeah.
Because if you click this to the top, you click the arrow on the screen.
It has to do with whether or not you expect migration.
I'm trying, I don't see it on my screen, that's the problem. Do you see them? Okay, so if I'm here. Yeah, I don't think it can. Should I swap displays? All right. Oh, 532. Yeah, and I'll mention, I'll get into some more specific information about both satellites after these slides, but I want to give some broad strokes first. But both satellites are in the green. I have a 532 wavelength. It's split from a 1064. Oh, nice. What did you do? Did it work?
It actually didn't do anything.
Okay.
Yeah, I can have box. We'll just stop. Oh, maybe we're sharing twice. It's good now.
Okay, but I can't access it on my. Oh wait, yeah. Okay, no. Great. Okay. This is another study by Mike looking at polar phenology, and he looked in both the North Polar Zone and the South Polar Zone using Calliope data from its launch until present. When this was published, I think this is a 2016, 2017 paper. He compared how biomass is changing again with the empirical relationship of BBP to phytoplankton carbon, and then took the derivative of that to see the rate of change, and saw places of blooming and bloom decay in both of these regions. And again, if you think back to the earlier plot, we know so little about the Arctic and Antarctic, both from the difficulty in getting there by ship or the expense, as well as until the launch of Calypso in 2006, there wasn't a way to remotely observe these areas. And so this is a study where he was asking some questions about how phytoplankton are blooming and what are the underlying controls that affect that, both top down and bottom up. This is a newer study by Xiaomei Liu in 2020, I think. This is a fun one. In ISAT-2 was launched in September 2018, and a month later, when it was flying over the Southern Ocean, she had downloaded some of the data and was able to produce vertical profiles from that data of the particular backscattering coefficient. So you're seeing that in the bottom in the C plot. And actually all of these are BBP, but they're in different places. And you can see the lat long, and they span roughly 50 south to 60 south. From space, the fact that we can produce figure like this still blows my mind. thinking about ISAT-2 in its orbit, and we can get these data were processed at 15 centimeter scale vertical resolution, again from a satellite. So this shows the power of ISAT-2.
Is that under the ice?
This is an open water.
The-
There wasn't much sea ice in the area. It was close to the ice edge, but it wasn't snuggled up to the ice edge. It was quite a bit away. Yeah. This is something that I worked on with Emmanuel and Mike during my postdoc, but we were comparing Modus Aqua backscattering data to Calliope backscattering data. And when we looked at monthly climatologies, we noticed there seemed to be this elevated latitudinal band that was migrating as you would go from summer to winter. We really didn't understand it and thought it might be some sort of geophysical signature, but not really a biological one. So you'd expect that to be near the coast or in obvious upwelling zones, etc. So this kicked off a 3-year exploration to understand which satellite was higher performing. In the end, what we discovered is that the Modus Aqua data had been significantly biased and still is, unfortunately, because of some of the atmospheric correction scheme. So this plot is showing the ratio of Modus Aqua to Calliope backscattering, and it varies at its, a factor of 2. So the red is a factor of 2 different. Dark blue is in the other direction. And then what I'm showing is some places where I picked out where there had been seasonal data available from bioargo flows. And you can see there's this artifactual seasonality introduced in Modus Aqua in some of these regions of disagreement, especially in the South Pacific or in the Indian Ocean, where you wouldn't expect there to be as pronounced seasonality as we saw. But ultimately, at the ocean color validation site, which I will talk about this more tomorrow, in the actual remote sensing reflectances, you can see a big separation, and again, this systematic seasonal bias. We could have found this without the Calliope data, but it really took comparing on global scales the differences of these 2 sensors, one independent active, one passive, and investigating why they had such a systematic disagreement in a sense to eventually land here. But also I will say, and we will talk about it a bit more tomorrow, anyone can download these data at any time. They're the data that are used for the at MOBI site to calibrate all ocean color satellites. And it's as simple as going to the website and downloading a CSV and plotting it. And unfortunately, which we'll talk about more tomorrow, there hadn't been enough checks to make sure that these data were agreeing on monthly scales. And so now work is currently ongoing, and Robert Ferrand, who's coming next week, is also leading the charge on this to really understand what in that atmospheric correction scheme is causing biases. And you can see they can be on the order in some cases of 40%. And these are the absolute value plots, but if you're interested, I can send this along, and there's some relative plots. But 40–50% relative error in remote sensing reflectance is now what we want. And the mission was designed to have 5% maximum relative error. Another point that I'll probably make a lot throughout this talk is that both satellites that I've mentioned were designed for different purposes. And so as an ocean community, it's really taken a very collaborative DIY type effort to use these data for our own curiosities, which is great because it invites more collaboration, open source science, and invention. ISAT-2, which I've mentioned, carries the ATLAS instrument, which is a photon counting altimeter. It's pretty basic. It doesn't have any polarization information. Again, at 10 kilohertz, it's 10,000 photons per second. You can get 10 centimeter vertical resolution in seawater, or if you don't want that, you can downsize to 1 meter, but it's very flexible. You have a lot of information. And on the ground, it has an 11-meter footprint. In contrast, Calypso, which has the Calliope instrument on board, is also a photon counting altimeter, but it has a bit more accessories, including a cross and polarization channel. And it's much lower frequency and magnitude. You can compare 10 kilohertz to 20 hertz. So the signal is definitely weaker in that sense, yielding a 21-meter vertical resolution signal in water, 30-meter resolution in air. It has and also in contrast, a 100-meter footprint, and it was measured to the study clouds. And I think because we know just one other in the room has worked with LIDAR, I wanted to relate these satellites to something you know well. So ISAT-2, in my opinion, it's really great, and it's just a phenomenal work, similar to Emmanuel C as a workhorse. Calypso and Calliope is also great, but again, it has those extra accessories with the polarization channel. I'm going to talk a little bit about the data processing and focus more on ISAT2, but I wanted to mention Calypso because the data are freely available online and they've already been massaged into a backscattering product, which make it very easy to use for anybody interested. This is the code to get that data, but I can also send along a link if that's easier. But there has undergone maybe 3 to 4 processing changes, and they haven't been super well documented in papers, but recently there's a paper that has produced more of the processing steps, and that's Mike's paper, which just came out last year. It's an RSE. This is the processing that I'm describing from that paper, and that's what the processing was used to create the data that are online. And essentially, the backscattering signal in green at 532 is roughly calculated as 7.2 times the particulate reflectance, and the particulate reflectance is derived by the cross and co-polarization channels, some theory of the theoretical backscattering at certain wind speeds and sun angle and crosstalk. So because there are these two channels, sometimes sub-signal gets partitioned into one versus the other. And so that can actually create some bigger differences. But ultimately, despite a lot of theory that can go into developing these products, it's still somewhat semi-empirically derived in the sense that they found 7.2 to be a sort of magic number that connects it with Modus Aqua. And as you know, Modus Aqua is somewhat biased. But again, it's kind of looking at the median value and getting things into play. Despite some issues maybe or some questions that are outstanding in the processing scheme, it has been compared with in situ data in at least 2 different studies, and that's growing. So one is one that I worked on with Emmanuel and Mike, and in this comparison study, again, we were asking the question, how do you compare in situ points with lines of data? Ultimately, we used a decorrelation approach to identify the space and time scales that were appropriate for comparing these point data compared to LIDAR in different zones. So highly variable, high latitudes had a smaller spatial radius that we would select compared to the lower latitude, lower value, longer length scales of variability. And across all these cases, so the top panel is looking at a plus or minus 3 hour difference, which is what's done at NASA for their processing, versus plus or minus 1 day difference, as well as using a variety of different backscattering algorithms on the Modus Aqua side to calculate backscattering. We found it improved performance both in meteor percent error and relative bias with the Calliope product, which is in black, compared to Modus Aqua, which is in purple, but again, all of those switches are in white. So that was honestly super surprising because we thought the Calliope data product was not as high quality. Certainly it hasn't been checked or validated by anybody really. And this isn't a formal validation in the sense, again, because we're using kind of generous space-time bounds by necessity because of the paucity of data. But we did find that it performed well, which is good. And another study, again, as I mentioned, takes some creative approaches. One really good way of comparing data products when you don't have exact matches is to use a statistical sort of empirical approach. So this is looking in a distributional sense, what the cumulative distribution functions look like when comparing a 9 by 9 kilometer and 16-day difference. So if you think about, and this study was on the North Atlantic, what happens in the water 16 days apart, there can be quite a bit that would change the backscattering coefficient. And on the bottom, it's a more generous 2 by 2 degree monthly grid. And again, this is aggregating all possible data in 1 month at 2 degree scales. And there, of course, you have differential sampling between what Modus Aqua can do and what Calliope can do. But this study also found that the Calliope data performed well with processing, but it's very, very sensitive to one parameter in particular, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. I spent a bit more time with ISAT2 because I think it's a really good way of understanding how LIDAR data are used and how they're processed, as well as some of the issues. So compared to Calliope, ISAT2 has a diffractometer on board and will separate the laser into 6 different beams. They're separated by in pairs, and so there's 3 pairs of a weak strong beam pairings. This is because it was invented to track elevation of land ice, and it creates sort of this swath-like observations as it's flying over ice zones where you have some spatial information. And the vertical resolution of the satellite is phenomenal. You can measure land ice, glacier, sea ice to accuracy plus or minus 2 centimeters. So again, this is a really strong, really cool signal. The data are available at that code. And you can even see bathymetry from this satellite. And so it again is extremely underutilized by the ocean community because it wasn't invented maybe for the ocean community. But you just think about what you might be able to do with bathymetry information from space, including places where there are corals, places where you have shallow enough seas that you can get some information there, and think about influences from coastal sediment, et cetera, et cetera. So I really like it for that. Another comparison of just the range of where LIDAR technology is headed is that the original ISAT, if it flew over football field, would have taken a measurement outside each end zone, whereas ISAT 2 takes measurements or would at each yard line. So again, you have super strong signal. And this is an image of an Atlas mock-up before it was in space. You have pulses of light that travel through the sensor, and they get, in this case, they get split into 6 beams, which again gives more information, but I won't spend too much time on the technical side there, but there's a ton of really great resources on the ISAT-2 mission website if anyone's interested or has other questions. I also wanted to highlight the ocean products because these are ones that maybe people in this room are interested in most. And the primary product that ocean studies have used so far is the ATL3 product. The ATL it stands for Atlas. And this is a very, very, very high size data product. It collects this data product is roughly 1 terabyte of data per day. So it requires a lot of extra down sampling and processing to work with it, but it's the most powerful. And this is the one where you get the geolocated photon height data, which I'll show in a bit. You can also, if you work in polar areas, use sea ice elevation, which I've used, and this is a great product because it has information about sea ice leads or fractures within sea ice. And again, because ISAT-2 is so powerful, it can actually quantify and detect where there's fractures or where there's gaps in sea ice compared to where the proper sea ice is. And I feel like it's like salesmen like going through all these products, but I just really wanted to highlight them again because people aren't using them really except for Shalme and me and our colleagues. And they're great. I think there's so much you could do here. The data, of course, are freely available online, and they take a bit to work with, but when you know how to work with them, you can play a lot. There's also a sea surface height product, and as Patrick talked about, that's because of the altimeter and the active product. And so you can get information even about wave height, of course, and in other aspects of sea ice height to derive physical information. Another thing that I've been really enjoying working on is looking at how we can try to see phytoplankton or sediments within sea ice fractures. So I'm showing a plot here. One way that the community has tried to find under ice investigations remotely is using BioArgo. So on the left, you can see the locations of where there've been an under ice Argo float collecting optical information. This is for a 3-year time period during October. And on the right, this is just 1 month of October, showing the location of sea ice leads longer than 200 meters. And so if you have a lead, and I'll get into this, but if you have a sea ice lead or fracture that's at least 200 meters long, if the signal characteristics are right, that's enough length that you can typically derive a signal in the subsurface. So this might be a way that we can quantify and understand phytoplankton even within the sea ice zone, which is, to me, it's outstanding. There's so much that you could do there. So I wanted to cover the processing so people have a good sense. This is what you would look like if you downloaded an ISAT-2 ATL3 product and you corrected it for geo height so that the ocean surface is at the 0 meters. You can see there's some, it's in this case, it's not waves. This is a polar product. So there's sea ice and then a floating sea ice chunk over there. But the way that you would derive backscattering as a function of depth is using some constants and then the actual what's called KD in the literature with ISAT-2, but it's not a proper KD. It's really the attenuation of the photons themselves at depth. And then when you have the single information, and every single backscattering profile derived from ISAT-2 has a calibration coefficient that is a way or an attempt to try to take all the atmospheric overlying information out of the equation. So after removing background noise, the signal is normalized to the photon count at the surface. And that acts as it includes background noise, it includes maybe some wind effects. And it keeps it so that you can compare each profile relative to the other one, independent of what the overlying conditions are. I will also say, because again, ISAT2 is highly, can resolve things very well vertically. It's different in this case. You can clearly see the ocean surface. With Calliope, as I mentioned, there's a 21-meter vertical resolution. So it's a bit trickier to really know what your ocean surface spin is, and it could contain some atmospheric information. So the way to do this is to take your signal and break it into vertical chunks, and you can decide as a user how you want to do that. However, for example, you need to be able to overcome the noise and have enough signal, so it does take a little bit of playing. One feature about ISAT2 is that it has a natural signal that would happen just hitting a pure water surface because of the differences of the index of refraction and the highly bright, highly scattering ocean surface. The photomultiplier tubes, which are in the receiver for the instrument, will get temporarily saturated and will have some dead time effects, and you will get these artificial, I think I have it here. You'll have artificial peaks that are not caused from anything natural in the water column, but instead they're after pulses of the instrument itself. You can see that also in this graph. So these are the normalized photon curves in the signal, and it's what's known as the impulse response function. So it's something that we know that happens. It unfortunately nonlinear is related to the signal, so you can't just subtract it out. It has to go through a deconvolution matrix, as it's also recursive with the signal. But you can see how that shows up here. You see these layers of photons. Those aren't too well scattering layers. They're artificial. There have been some methods, because this can get kind of in the weeds, and it can also be slightly sensitive to choice of processing. There have been more recent methods that use a machine learning approach where it doesn't matter if you can or cannot detect these after pulses, and it kind of gets swallowed in. But as I mentioned, this is the impulse response function on the left. And what you do is you set up a deconvolution matrix that is basically taking and translating the impulse response function into these depth coordinates. And then you can invert the signal using inverse matrix multiplication to get your new signal. And then when you have your new signal, you can then do some cleaning and calculate the theoretical backscattering coefficient as a function of wind speed and viewing angle. And typically, if there's a pointing angle or off nadir viewing for ISAT2, it's no more than 2 degrees. And this is a place where ancillary data come in. So it's a model a lot of times, but there's these 1 hour hourly data products from wind speed that you can use. And this is a place where if you had a super windy day, for example, you might want to throw out the data or just be aware that the surface and the back, all the noise could be from bubbles or something else. And this is slightly different from ocean color processing, because you might be able to better understand when you're in a glint situation versus not. But here you kind of need ancillary data to help with that. And yeah, so as I mentioned, again, there's a calibration coefficient. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but the thing I really want to point out is that you can see here the backscattering vertical profile or et al. That you're retrieving is very proportional to this beta pi term in the denominator. And that term, at least from field and modeling work, is extremely variable. It's very hard to make measurements at 180 degrees nadir, which is how the sensors are. So much so that it wasn't even included in this graph by this paper by Twardarski, Sullivan and Twardarski in 2009. And you can see how much it varies by roughly a factor of 2, depending on where you are, and also the fact that it just varies at all. And both ISAT2 and Calliope have used values ranging from 0.16 to 0.32 at this angle of 180 across everywhere in the ocean. And as you can imagine, that can adjust your backscattering product by a factor of 2. So this is an area that for me is also ripe for more work, either on this end or on the sensitivity side of playing with ISAT2 or Calliope data and understanding what would be most appropriate to choose depending on your water condition. This is another quirk of working with data at this low level that I would just mention is also maybe somewhat different from a passive remote sensor, is that when the receiver channels, the photomultiplier tubes become saturated, they just stop working. So if they're super saturated by something really bright, like sea ice or super bright ocean, it stops collecting photons, and there could be more emanating from the ocean surface, but it won't be received and collected by the sensor. So then you have no idea. The uncertainty is impossible to calculate because there could be a lot you're missing or there could be nothing. And what does happen and is helpful is there's a lot of processing variables you can use. And here, this is a really beautiful case of showing what happens. There's a full saturation happening at like 76.57-ish north. And when that happens, you have these dead time signals. And again, it's similar to the after pulses where the sensor gets so saturated and it takes time to recover, and then it's able to receive more. So these data are not usable, but I wanted to show it and talk about how important understanding these issues are in the context of open source science. And I'm on the ICET2 science team, and it's been a lot of fun. And it's also been very meaningful, I think, to be on a team that isn't charged with ocean science as a priority, because it gets you thinking in different ways and meeting collaborations you might not otherwise have had. And in particular, this team, in terms of gender and career stage, is the most diverse I've ever seen. And I really hope that as an ocean community, we can also get to this place with the next case call. But it has felt very different to be in a team like this that is very collaborative, and it could be in part because the data are very difficult to work with, and so it's sort of a necessity to collaborate. But there's this giant push, as many of you might know, from NASA as well. It's called TOPS. It's a transition to open source science. And it's because everybody's realizing that open source science benefits everybody. It might create more collaborators, it might create more citations or reproducibility of your work. It creates, if nothing else, a way that people can track to see what you've done and build off of it, and not spend all of our time trying to reproduce results or whatever. So with ICET2 in particular, as I mentioned, the data are huge, 1 terabyte per day, and we might encounter something similar with PACE. And so knowing what appropriate variables are to use and knowing how to minimize computation time, which is great for both science and also for the environment, is super important. So there's also a journal of open source software, I think that's relatively new, that I would encourage anybody to consider submitting their work to. It has a DOI, and it's a good way of getting really great, like, sort of computer science reviewers' eyes on your code and helping you understand how well it's annotated or how well it's set up. I don't know how we are in time. I don't need to show these. Oh, okay, we're fine. I guess maybe we touch a little bit on some ongoing work. This is work that I'm working on with Emmanuel, and also Sasha and Ali Chase, who will be coming to the class, and Jeremy. So it's been very fun. But the idea here is, if we know we have a quality product from LIDAR and from Ocean Color, how do we best combine them, and what can we learn that's new? So this is some work that I'm undertaking now. But again, the idea is, if Ocean Color is an inverse problem, we have remote sensing reflectance. If we know backscattering well from LIDAR, that eliminates one parameter to be solved for in the inversion. And then in theory, we could have possibly a better absorption product. So that's, I've tested that in a simulated case, basically runs that were generated by Hydrolite to conduct independent backscattering, remote sensing reflectance, and then absorption. And in this case, because it's simulated data, we have a known absorption that we trust, that we can compare it to. So when we incorporated the independent backscattering product in the inversion, that's in orange, you can see it falls a bit more along the 1-to-1 line with less scatter than in the other case. So it's sort of a theoretical motivation, confirmation that this could be a good idea. On global scales, unfortunately, we don't have enough absorption data to validate or confirm that we have improvement with this approach. But what I find interesting is that when you stitch the two together in an inversion, you can have relative differences that are on the order of 50% in absorption. And this is at any wavelength. What I'm showing here, I think, is 443 nanometers. And so, as we know, if you have absorption differences of that level, it could be to a number of underlying factors. But getting absorption, knowing that can be an uncertainty in retrieved absorption from space is important, so we can make sure we're not attributing, for example, a 10% change to something that's biogeochemical when it could be something that's more an instrument difference. I guess to summarize, one thing that is great about LIDAR for the oceans, and that will continue to grow, is that it wasn't, although it wasn't generated yet for ocean work, it provides an independent measurement of backscattering, which is really important for understanding optical closure on local to global scales, as well as understanding or having a product that we can yeah, I mean, like have separate. So in the earlier plot that Patrick and I showed where we had phytoplankton carbon from ocean color, now we have a way of getting phytoplankton carbon that's independent of remote sensing reflectance, thereby increasing our information content and possibly enabling different type of modeling work, and at least now having one more piece of information we can have in our toolkit. Also, we found it to be more accurate and less biased than ocean color. So that's always nice if we have a product that we can trust and that it's high quality. The thing that I'm most excited about recently with satellite LIDAR is how it can have, especially with ICET2, just absolutely outstanding resolution and the ability to see into these cracks in the poles that it's really difficult to access otherwise. And now we have a way synoptically possibly to observe these changes. And just think about the kinds of questions you could ask and with that type of information, especially spanning a mission 5, 10, 15, etc. years in these regions that we know are undergoing rapid change. When we have polarization information in the case of Calypso, it also offers additional information and data to be used. And Patrick will be talking about polarization later. I didn't want to focus on it today, but it's also a really great plus, as I said, an accessory similar to Emmanuel's onesie thing to use in our tool belt, which is great. It's not all perfect. I think the challenges are also, for me, the areas that are the most ripe for improvement, and especially great for anyone in an early career stage like me, because the data are enough of an intimidation that a lot of people don't use them, and it doesn't take much to quickly get into it, especially with all the open source code. And because there's a lot of communication, extremely well documented software packages and data products, it just takes a little bit of extra time. And I'm not just saying that it's not that rough to work with, and I'd be happy to help with anybody who's interested in working on this. But because of that, there's no route that people agree on as a community that's a centralized, this is the way, which means you can think about your own way, think about what kind of processing you would like to do. And also it's seriously numerous and very useful to the community types of studies that you can do that, in my opinion, are very, very low lying fruit. I mentioned the uncertainty related to the beta pi values. And again, this is another area that one could do a lot of work on, whether or not just comparing in different places, if it makes sense to use one or the other, or just understanding the uncertainty and communicating that better to people who are using the products. There are 2 phenomenal reviews about LIDAR, and I wanted to point those out here. One is by Chris Hostetler, and the other is by Cedric Jamais. They have great images, figures, and a really nice history of how the community has thought about satellite LIDAR, back to it being maybe just for the atmospheric ocean community. And recently there's a lot more excitement and acceptance about this technique and what it can offer us. So again, sort of in conclusion, with satellite LIDAR products, we can see into polar night, which offers a big advantage over ocean color products. We've also seen so far that it's outperformed ocean color products, and so we can have some trust in using it to a certain extent. Unlike ocean color, it offers vertical resolution. And I think for all of us, any kind of work we're doing, having some sort of quantification of what's in the water column as opposed to assuming uniform water column could lead to some very exciting questions in our work. There is a bit of hand-holding that takes place with using the ICET2 products, but it's very collaborative, and there's a lot of resources out there to streamline and sort of set up pipelines for these data processing activities. And whether or not it's LIDAR or something else, open source science is very important and really helps remove barrier axes to producing good science, and also involving more collaborators, more diverse set of collaborators. And it's probably better and more enabled by code in particular that's really available and not expensive. And so this has been one thing that I've worked on with ICET2, and it's been very, very, very humbling and very embarrassing at times, is converting my knowledge base from MATLAB to Python, because Python is more freely available and used by a wider community. And I think there is a lot of push for people if they have the time to do that. And I'm currently involved in a community. There's something, I have a slide for this, that I met at an ICET2 Hack Week, and we all sort of shared our frustrations or ego frustrations about not being able to transition super cleanly or right away to Python when it would take like an hour or 2 to write lines of code you could do in 2 seconds, you know? And we met every week and just sort of as a support group, developing software for ISET2, and we're now maybe a month or so away from submitting a paper that we've been working on. And so I've also found a lot of both fun and support from communities that are working on data sets that are pretty involved with the idea of it being like a patient peer support, slow and steady work. And I think Emmanuel set this out, but there's a hack week for ISET2 happening in August of this year, and the deadline to apply was this week. But if anybody is interested, I'm on the organizing committee, and if you want to go, I can talk about extending that through. Yeah. Great. This is all I have, and we're 5 minutes shy of lunch.
You filmed a video of the space one LiDAR and then China one over the line.
Yeah, when it's dark and you can see the lasers. Yeah, that's a good idea. I did initially had some links to videos because the communication